Selfish means prioritizing. Africa first, beneficiating our minerals on African soil, processing our agriculture into global grants, manufacturing pharmaceuticals that secure our health sovereignty. Selfish means demanding fair terms in every deal, rejecting exploitation disguised as aid, and leveraging our collective weight to negotiate from strength.
What if the most powerful geopolitical shift in West Africa didn't happen at a summit, or in a palace, or in a military barracks, but on a road no one was watching? What if the real story in the Sahel is not about coups, sanctions, or speeches, but about trucks quietly changing direction? Why did certain ports begin to feel less certain? Why did freight tables start adjusting? Why did corridors once treated as permanent suddenly look optional? Let's find out. Before anyone talks about unlocking new routes, we need to understand how the lock was built in the first place. The Sahel did not wake up one day and decide to depend on a single corridor to the sea. That structure was layered over time, first through colonial engineering, then through post-independence inertia, and finally through economic habit. During the colonial period, railways in West Africa were not designed to connect African economies to each other. They were extraction lines. Tracks ran from inland resource zones straight to coastal ports. Gold, cotton, livestock, uranium, everything flowed outward. The logic was simple. Move raw materials efficiently to ships. The interior was not meant to negotiate. It was meant to supply. After independence, those same physical corridors remained. Roads were expanded along the same axes. Insurance companies priced risk based on those established routes. Freight companies optimized around familiarity. Over time, this created what economists call path dependency, when historical choices lock future options into predictable channels. For countries like Niger, a significant portion of imports moved through the port of Cotonou in Benin. Fuel, construction materials, food imports, they traveled south to the coast before heading inland. For Burkina Faso and Mali, southern coastal gateways also dominated transit flows. Economically, it was rational. Ports had infrastructure. Customs systems were aligned. Transport companies knew the roads. The more traffic a corridor handled, the more efficient it became. Efficiency reinforced concentration. Concentration reinforced dependency. And dependency creates asymmetry. If 70% of your essential imports pass through one route, that route is no longer just a road. It is leverage. It is an influence. It is quiet power embedded in logistics. This is not about hostility between neighbors. It is about structural exposure. When everything flows through a narrow channel, any disruption, political, economic, or security-related, multiplies its impact. Border closures are no longer symbolic gestures. They become economic pressure points. Sanctions are not abstract statements. They tighten real supply chains. The Sahel's vulnerability was not geography alone. It was channel concentration. And concentration has consequences beyond trade. It shapes negotiation posture. A landlocked country with a single reliable maritime corridor negotiates differently from one with options. It approaches diplomacy differently. It calculates risk differently. Even domestic politics can be influenced by how exposed supply chains are. For decades, this funnel architecture remained largely unquestioned because it functioned smoothly. The system was stable enough that its fragility was invisible, until it wasn't. When sanctions and political tensions began affecting transit access in the region, the funnel stopped being theoretical. It became tangible. Fuel prices reflected it. Import delays exposed it. Insurance premiums responded to it. That moment did not create dependency, it revealed it. And once a structural weakness becomes visible, it forces a decision: adapt or remain exposed. So the real shift did not begin with anger. It began with recognition. If the old architecture concentrated vulnerability, could a new one distribute resilience? Recognition alone does nothing. Systems only change when pressure forces them to. The pressure came in waves. After the 2023 coup in Niger, ECOWAS imposed sanctions. Borders tightened. Financial transactions were restricted. Airspace limitations followed. But the most immediate shock was logistical. Fuel convoys slowed, trucks idled at crossings, import timelines stretched. What had once felt automatic, southern access through familiar corridors, suddenly became conditional. And this is where something crucial happened. Instead of collapsing into paralysis, the Sahel recalculated. Within weeks, Niger began accelerating the use of the port of Lomé in Togo. Alternative maritime entries through Ghana's Tema port gained relevance. Transit convoys were rerouted. Customs agreements were revisited. Military escorts were reorganized to secure longer inland journeys. The cost structure shifted. Some alternative corridors were longer. Some were more expensive per kilometer. But strategic cost and economic cost are not always the same calculation. The old model prioritized efficiency. The new model prioritized resilience. That difference changes everything. For Burkina Faso and Mali, similar recalibrations unfolded. Southern reliance diversified. Northern conversations intensified, particularly toward Algeria as a potential Mediterranean link for long-term integration. None of this happened with dramatic declarations. It happened through paperwork, through meetings between transport ministries, through logistics companies quietly adjusting schedules. And that quietness is important, because what was unfolding was not a protest, it was engineering. If 80% of your imports depend on a single route, disruption becomes existential. But if that concentration drops to 50%, then 40%, then 30% over time, the system stabilizes differently. Insurance markets notice that diversification. Freight companies price risk differently when redundancy exists. Investors begin to see flexibility rather than fragility. This was not an emotional reaction to sanctions, it was a structural correction, and the shock revealed something deeper. Vulnerability is often invisible until stress exposes it. Think of global supply chains during COVID-19. One port closure in Asia rippled across continents. Semiconductor shortages exposed manufacturing concentration. Nations that once trusted single-source efficiency suddenly rushed to diversify suppliers. The Sahel's moment was similar, just regional and compressed. The sanctions acted like a stress test. They showed where the system bent. The response was not to patch the old route only, but to multiply routes. And here is where the posture changed. When new corridors began functioning, inland states were no longer negotiating in urgency. They were calculating from options. Option A, Option B, Option C. Choice alters tone. The question stopped being, will the corridor reopen? And became, which corridor best serves our strategic interests now? That psychological pivot matters as much as asphalt. Because when a nation realizes it can move without a single gatekeeper, the relationship to power transforms. But once inland states diversified, how did that shift ripple outward, especially among the coastal economies that had long assumed transit centrality? Ports do not sleep. They calculate. Every container that moves inland generates handling fees, fuel sales, customs charges, storage payments, and trucking contracts. For coastal states, transit trade from landlocked neighbors is not charity. It is revenue. It is employment. It is leverage wrapped in logistics. For years, certain corridors operated with quiet certainty. Inland trade volumes were predictable. Shipping agents knew the patterns. Warehouses were structured around that stability. A port like Colonial in Benin did not merely serve domestic imports. It functioned as a gateway for neighboring economies, especially Niger. That relationship was mutually beneficial, but it was also asymmetrical, because indispensability breeds assumption. When sanctions disrupted Niger's southern flow, and when rerouting through Lomé in Togo and Tema in Ghana intensified, something subtle happened along the coast. Transit volumes fluctuated. In the world of port management, even a 15 to 20% shift is noticeable. It alters forecasting, it changes staffing needs, it forces reevaluation of capacity utilization. Ports compete regionally for relevance, and inland trade is a steady client base. When that client begins distributing volume elsewhere, competition awakens, and competition changes tone. Transit fees become negotiable. Clearance speed becomes strategic. Infrastructure upgrades gain urgency. Road rehabilitation accelerates. Diplomatic language softens. This is not a confrontation. It is market logic applied to geopolitics. By diversifying corridors, the Sahel did not weaken coastal neighbors. It introduced elasticity into a relationship that had hardened over decades. Instead of a single indispensable gate, there were now multiple viable entries. That reduces unilateral leverage and increases mutual respect. And here is the deeper detail that rarely gets discussed. Redundancy creates bargaining symmetry. When inland states had one dominant corridor, delays translated into immediate economic stress. That urgency limited the negotiating room. But when alternative ports were functional, inland governments could calculate transit conditions more calmly. They could compare processing times, compare tariffs, compare political atmospheres. Choice converts vulnerability into strategy. It also rebalances regional diplomacy. Coastal states begin to see landlocked neighbors not merely as dependent partners, but as mobile clients. Mobility introduces accountability. No port wants to be bypassed consistently. No corridor wants to lose relevance. And so the entire West African logistics ecosystem subtly shifted from assumption to competition. This shift is not loud. It does not make headlines, but it reshapes posture. The old arrangement functioned like a funnel. The new one behaves more like a network. Networks distribute power. Funnels concentrate it. And once the interior demonstrates that it can navigate the network, it signals something powerful to its own population. We are not trapped. That message travels beyond trade. Because if leverage can be redistributed along supply chains, what else in the regional system might be renegotiable once the mindset shifts? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Long before roads are rebuilt, something else is rebuilt first: the imagination. For decades, the word landlocked functioned almost like a diagnosis in West Africa. It sounded clinical, neutral, final. It implied limitation without debate. It quietly suggested that inland states would always negotiate from exposure, that their economic oxygen would always pass through someone else's shoreline. But when alternative corridors began functioning, not in theory, but in motion, that mental framing cracked. And that crack matters more than asphalt. Young people in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are not moved by abstract speeches about sovereignty. They have grown up watching sanctions, debt cycles, currency debates, and security crises. They are skeptical of slogans. They look for structural shifts. Diversified routes are structural.
Africa cannot trade at a scale if its people, goods, services, and ideas remain constrained by outdated systems and unnecessary barriers.
When fuel keeps arriving despite political pressure, when imports continue despite diplomatic tension, when trucks take longer roads but still arrive, it sends a message. It says the system is adjustable. It says vulnerability is not permanent. That realization widens perspective. Historically, figures like Thomas Sankara spoke about self-reliance in agriculture and industry. His message was not isolation, it was dignity. It was the idea that psychological liberation precedes economic liberation, that a country must first believe it can stand differently before it can actually do so.
Well, we need to work to decolonize the mindsets, to overthrow the regime in Upper Volta. It might not be necessary to bring in heavily armed mercenaries. It is simply enough to prohibit the import of champagne or lipstick, I don't know, or nail polish. That's enough to overthrow us. Because the petty bourgeoisie today is convinced that they cannot do without these products.
Today's recalibration echoes that philosophy, but through logistics rather than ideology. Instead of declaring independence from corridors, the Sahel multiplied them. Instead of cutting ties, it diversified ties. That difference is critical. It shows maturity rather than rebellion. Under leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, the framing of sovereignty has leaned heavily towards structural repositioning, gold refining, domestic industrial capacity, and new security alignments. Whether one agrees with every method or not, the appeal to youth is clear. Systems are being redesigned, not merely criticized. And when a generation sees systems shift, even slightly, its political psychology changes. It stops asking, "Why are we blocked?" and begins asking, "What else can we redesign?" That shift is expansive, because once geography is no longer treated as fate, other inherited constraints become negotiable too. Currency arrangements, energy dependency, food imports, external financial oversight, military architecture. Diversified sea access is not just a transport decision, it is a proof of concept. It demonstrates that what looked fixed can be recalibrated. Psychology in geopolitics is rarely discussed openly, but it is powerful. Nations that see themselves as perpetually exposed behave cautiously. Nations that see themselves as strategically flexible behave differently. They negotiate differently. They invest differently. They take calculated risks rather than reactive ones. And that is what changed in the Sahel. The interior stopped seeing itself as boxed in. It started seeing itself as positioned. But if the mind has shifted and the roots are multiplying, the next question becomes unavoidable. Does this psychological transformation translate into long-term structural power, or is it only symbolic? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. It is not symbolic, because in the modern world, supply chains are not technical details. They are geopolitical architecture. Look beyond West Africa for a moment. When the Suez Canal was blocked in 2021, global trade froze. When tensions escalated in the Red Sea, shipping companies rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks and billions in cost. When the Strait of Hormuz is threatened, energy markets tremble. Choke points define power. And what the Sahel confronted during sanctions was its own choke point problem. If one corridor carries the bulk of your fuel, medicine, construction materials, and industrial inputs, that corridor is not just a road. It is a pressure valve. Whoever influences it influences you. By diversifying routes, the Sahel reduced single-point failure risk. That is not emotional. That is systems engineering. In systems theory, resilience increases when redundancy exists. One node fails, others compensate. The network survives. The shock is absorbed rather than amplified. When Niger strengthened access through multiple southern ports, and when Burkina Faso expanded alternative maritime corridors, the effect was cumulative. Insurance companies recalculated political exposure. Freight forwarders priced shipments differently. Transit negotiations became more flexible. That flexibility feeds directly into bargaining power. Because negotiation is not about volume alone, it is about options. If an inland state can redirect 30% of its trade through a competing port, it gains leverage in discussions about transit fees, customs efficiency, infrastructure investment, and diplomatic tone. Over time, even small percentage shifts compound into structural influence. And here is the deeper layer. Financial perception follows logistical resilience. When rating agencies assess country risk, they consider political stability, fiscal management, and economic exposure. Heavy dependence on a single trade corridor increases vulnerability. Diversification reduces that exposure. Reduced exposure can influence borrowing conditions. Better borrowing conditions expand fiscal space. Expanded fiscal space funds domestic priorities, energy, agriculture, and processing industries. It all connects. This is why diversified sea access is not just about trucks. It is about credit ratings, bond yields, trade insurance, and investor confidence. It changes the macroeconomic equation. And once macroeconomic posture improves, geopolitical posture follows. A state less exposed to transit shocks negotiates differently in regional forums. It approaches partnerships from calculation rather than urgency. It can withstand diplomatic friction longer. It can choose alignment rather than default to necessity. That is leverage. And leverage is contagious. Because when one structural vulnerability is reduced, political imagination expands further. If corridors can be diversified, then export patterns can be restructured. If export patterns can shift, then value chains can be localized. If value chains localize, the domestic industry strengthens. The network effect compounds. This is not an instant transformation. It is an incremental architecture. But architecture determines ceilings. The Sahel has begun raising its ceiling by reinforcing its logistical floor. And if logistics has become leverage, then the final question is larger than trade routes. Are we witnessing the quiet redrawing of the colonial economic map itself? No one redrew the borders. No new country was created. No coastline suddenly appeared. The Atlantic did not move north. The Mediterranean did not stretch south. The lines on the map remain exactly where they were. And yet, the geometry has shifted. For more than a century, West Africa's economic logic followed a simple design: extract inland, export outward. Railways were laid for that purpose. Roads followed those railways. Ports expanded around that traffic. The interior's role was to feed the coast. The coast's role was to ship outward. It was a straight-line model. Today, that line is bending. When Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger began multiplying maritime access points, they did something subtle but historic. They disrupted the inherited extraction funnel without altering a single national border. Instead of one dominant southbound artery, there are now multiple viable corridors. Southern, western, and even northern possibilities are under long-term consideration. What was once linear is becoming networked. Networks are harder to control than funnels. A funnel concentrates pressure. A network distributes it. And when pressure is distributed, dependency weakens. This is where the shift becomes philosophical. For decades, the conversation around Africa's interior centered on limitation. Landlocked meant disadvantaged. Distance from the sea meant a structural handicap. Every economic forecast began with that constraint. But constraints are not absolute. They are contextual. Switzerland is landlocked and globally integrated. Rwanda is landlocked and regionally dynamic. Ethiopia lost direct sea access in the 1990s and built a rail to Djibouti to compensate. Geography imposes friction, yes, but friction can be engineered around. The Sahel has started engineering. And here is what makes this moment broader than logistics. It challenges the psychological inheritance of the colonial map. The colonial map was not just territorial, it was economic choreography. It assigned roles. It positioned interior regions as suppliers. It centralized maritime gateways as decisive nodes. When inland states reduce exclusive reliance on any single gateway, they quietly question that choreography. They do not burn the old map, they built over it. That is more powerful, because transformation does not always require confrontation. Sometimes it requires a redesign. This redesign sends a message to a generation tired of hearing that structural disadvantages are permanent. It demonstrates that vulnerability can be diluted through planning. That leverage can be balanced through alternatives. That geography is not destiny, it is infrastructure plus imagination. And once imagination shifts, politics follows. The trucks moving across new corridors are not just carrying fuel or machinery. They are carrying a different posture. A posture that says access is negotiable, that partnerships are multiple, that survival does not depend on a single gate. The borders remain the same, but the power flows differently. And if power can flow differently without rewriting the map, then perhaps the real question for the next decade is not where Africa's borders lie, but how many of its inherited systems are quietly being redesigned beneath them. Let us know in the comment section. Is this what Africa should be doing? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.